The starvation was deliberate. In the spring of 1943, while British propaganda celebrated the heroic sacrifices being made to defeat fascism, the British government was quietly implementing a policy that would kill 3 million people in a matter of months. The policy had a bureaucratic name. It was called the Denial of Rice Policy and the Boat Denial Policy. But strip away the administrative language and the truth becomes clear. It was a plan to starve an entire region to death to protect British military supplies. The dead were not casualties of war in the conventional sense. They were not killed by bombs or bullets. They were killed by a government that decided their lives were worth less than the logistical convenience of the British Empire. And the man who made that decision, the man who signed the orders and dismissed the warnings, was Winston Churchill, the same man the Western world still celebrates as a hero of freedom. If you think the Bengal Famine of 1943 was a natural disaster or an unfortunate side effect of war, what I'm about to show you will destroy that illusion. Because the documents that the British government hid for 70 years prove beyond doubt that the famine was not an accident. It was a policy, and it was implemented with full knowledge of the death toll it would create. The death toll. They hid 3 million people. That is the conservative estimate. Some historians put the number closer to 4 million. To understand that scale, imagine every single person in Chicago dying in 6 months. Imagine the entire population of Berlin vanishing. Imagine a death toll larger than the Jewish Holocaust in Poland, concentrated in a single province, in a single year. And here's what makes it worse. There was food available. Bengal wasn't hit by a drought that destroyed the crops. The harvest of 1942 was below average, but it was sufficient to feed the population. The starvation happened because the British colonial government seized the food. They took it from the villages. They took it from the markets. They loaded it onto trains and trucks and shipped it out of Bengal to feed British soldiers and to stockpile it in case of a Japanese invasion that never came. The policy was explicit. British officials were ordered to remove all rice and all boats from the coastal regions of Bengal. The rice was taken to deny it to the Japanese if they invaded. The boats were taken to prevent the Japanese from using them for transportation, but the Japanese never invaded Bengal. The invasion never came. And the rice that was seized, the rice that could have fed millions, sat in British warehouses and rotted. While the rice rotted, the people of Bengal starved. They starved in villages where the granaries had been emptied by British officials. They starved in cities where the markets had no food because the government had confiscated it. They starved on the roads, walking hundreds of miles looking for something to eat, collapsing in ditches and dying alone. And the British government knew. They received reports every week detailing the deaths. They received telegrams from Indian officials begging for food relief. They received pleas from doctors describing the corpses piling up in the streets of Calcutta. And they did nothing. Actually, that's not quite accurate. They didn't do nothing. They made it worse. The ships that never came. While millions of Bengalis were dying of starvation, British ships loaded with grain were sailing past India to stockpile food in Europe and the Mediterranean. Winston Churchill personally refused to divert those ships to Bengal. He received urgent cables from the Viceroy, from Indian politicians, from his own officials in India, all begging him to send food. He refused every request. In one meeting, when confronted with the scale of the death toll, Churchill asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet, if the famine was so bad. In another, he blamed the Indians themselves, saying they bred like rabbits, and that the famine was their own fault for existing in such numbers. These are not rumors. These are documented statements from British cabinet meetings. They were classified for decades. They were hidden in archives that the British government refused to open. But historians eventually got access, and the truth came out. Churchill didn't just refuse to help. He actively blocked others from helping. When Canada and Australia offered to send grain shipments to India, Churchill's government rejected the offers. When the United States expressed concern, British diplomats assured them the situation was under control, that the reports were exaggerated, that food relief was unnecessary. It was a lie. The British government was lying to its allies while millions of people starved to death under British rule. But here's the question that should terrify you. Why? Why would Britain deliberately starve 3 million of its own colonial subjects? What possible strategic benefit could justify mass murder on this scale? The answer is brutally simple. Britain was broke, the empire was bankrupt, and the only way to keep fighting the war was to extract every possible resource from the colonies, even if that meant killing millions of people to do it. The context of imperial extraction. To understand how Britain could commit an atrocity of this magnitude, you have to understand the economics of empire in 1943. The British government was spending money. It didn't have to fight a war. It was losing. The gold reserves were gone. The American loans were barely keeping the country afloat. And the only thing that allowed Britain to project military power in Asia was the ruthless extraction of wealth from India. India didn't just provide soldiers for the British war effort. It provided food, raw materials, and money. The colonial system worked like this. Indian farmers grew rice and wheat. The British government bought that food at artificially low prices set by colonial law. The food was then used to feed British soldiers, British civilians, and British allies. India was the quartermaster of the empire. But by 1943, the system was breaking down. The Japanese had conquered Burma, which had been a major rice exporter. The supply chains across Asia were collapsing. The British military was demanding more food, not less, because they were now fighting on multiple fronts. North Africa, Europe, and Asia all needed supplies. The British cabinet looked at the map and made a calculation. They decided that feeding British soldiers was more important than feeding Indian civilians. They decided that stockpiling food, in case of future military operations, was more important than preventing a famine that was already happening. They decided that the lives of Indians simply didn't matter as much as the strategic goals of the empire. This wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a mistake made by low-level bureaucrats. This was policy set at the highest levels of government. The War Cabinet in London received detailed reports about the famine. They knew people were dying. They knew the death toll was in the hundreds of thousands and climbing, and they consciously chose not to divert resources to stop it. The denial policies. The mechanics of the starvation began with two interconnected policies implemented in early 1943. The first was the boat denial policy. British officials ordered the confiscation of all boats in the coastal regions of Bengal. The official reason was to prevent the Japanese from using them if they invaded, but the real effect was to destroy the internal economy of Bengal. Bengal is a region of rivers and waterways. The entire transportation system depended on boats. Farmers used boats to take their produce to market. Fishermen used boats to catch fish, which was the primary source of protein for millions of people. Traders used boats to move goods between villages. When the British seized over 60,000 boats, they didn't just take transportation. They took the ability of the region to feed itself. The second policy was the denial of rice. British officials swept through the countryside, buying up or confiscating rice from farmers, traders, and merchants. The official justification was that this rice needed to be denied to the Japanese, but the rice wasn't destroyed. It was stockpiled in warehouses controlled by the British military. It was shipped out of Bengal to other parts of India and to Ceylon. It was reserved for British and Allied troops. The combination of these two policies created a catastrophic situation. The food production system was disrupted, the distribution system was destroyed, and the colonial government, which had created the crisis, refused to take responsibility for solving it. Indian officials in the colonial administration saw what was happening and sounded the alarm. The governor of Bengal, a British official named John Herbert, sent repeated telegrams to London warning that a famine was developing. He requested emergency food shipments. He asked for permission to stop the rice denial policy. He was ignored. By the summer of 1943, the famine had reached catastrophic proportions. The death rate in rural Bengal was skyrocketing. People were eating grass, leaves, and tree bark. Families were selling their children to try to buy food. Villages were being abandoned as the survivors fled to the cities looking for relief that didn't exist. And still, the British government continued to export food from India. Even as millions of Indians were starving, India remained a net exporter of grain. Ships loaded with wheat left the ports of Calcutta and Karachi, bound for British troops in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The food that could have saved millions of lives was being shipped away to feed soldiers and to build stockpiles that would never be used. Churchill's response. The telegrams from India arrived at 10 Downing Street with increasing urgency. The Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, sent cables warning that the situation was out of control. He reported that people were dying in the streets of Calcutta at a rate of thousands per day. He begged Churchill to authorize emergency food shipments. Churchill's response was to do nothing and to blame the Indians. In cabinet meetings, he made remarks that revealed his contempt for the people who were dying. He said that the famine was caused by Indian breeding habits. He said that Indians were the beastliest people in the world next to the Germans. He asked why, if the famine was so terrible, Gandhi hadn't died from it yet. These statements are documented in the cabinet records. They were written down by the cabinet secretary. They were classified for decades, but historians have now recovered them from the British National Archives. There is no ambiguity here. Churchill knew what was happening. He was informed repeatedly, and his response was racist dismissal and bureaucratic obstruction. When his own Secretary of State for India, Leopold Amery, pleaded with him to send food relief, Churchill refused. When the Viceroy requested permission to stop exporting food from India, Churchill denied the request. When Australia and Canada offered to send grain shipments, Churchill's government turned them down, saying that shipping was needed for military purposes and couldn't be spared for famine relief. But here's the damning detail. At the same time that Churchill was refusing to divert ships to carry food to Bengal, he was authorizing the creation of massive stockpiles of food in other parts of the empire. Grain was being accumulated in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, and in Europe, in preparation for future military operations. Some of this grain was never used. It sat in warehouses and rotted. It could have been sent to Bengal. It wasn't. The official British position was that there was no shipping available. They claimed that every ship was needed for military operations and that diverting ships to carry food to India would compromise the war effort. But this was a lie. British and American ships were making regular supply runs to Australia, to the Middle East, and to the Soviet Union. Any one of those ships could have been diverted to India. The shipping existed. The will to use it did not. The starvation in the streets. By August 1943, the famine had turned the streets of Calcutta into scenes of horror. The city, which had been a center of commerce and culture, became a graveyard. Refugees from the countryside poured into the city at a rate of thousands per day, hoping to find food or work. Instead, they found nothing. People died on the sidewalks. They died in doorways. They died in the parks and in the railway stations. The corpses piled up faster than the municipal authorities could collect them. Trucks would drive through the streets in the morning, picking up the bodies of those who had died overnight. The workers stopped counting. They just loaded the corpses into the trucks and took them to mass graves or to cremation grounds. The scenes were apocalyptic. Women held starving children in their arms, begging for food from passers-by who had nothing to give. Men collapsed from hunger and weakness, too tired to move, waiting to die. Families sat together in groups, staring blankly, their bodies wasting away, knowing that no help was coming. And through all of this, the British colonial government maintained its policy. The food exports continued. The stockpiles grew. The military supply chains operated smoothly. The war effort was unaffected. Indian doctors and relief workers tried to organize aid. They set up soup kitchens with whatever resources they could scrape together. They pleaded with the government for supplies. They were given nothing. The colonial authorities told them that the situation was temporary, that the harvest would improve, that relief was coming. It was all lies. The truth was that the British government had made a calculation. The lives of 3 million Indians were worth less than the logistical convenience of maintaining food stockpiles and uninterrupted military supply chains. It was a cost-benefit analysis where Indian lives were assigned a value of 0. And the calculation worked, from the British perspective. The war effort in Asia continued without disruption. British troops were fed, the stockpiles were maintained, the strategic goals of the empire were achieved. The only cost was 3 million dead Indians. And to the men in London who made these decisions, that was an acceptable price. The economic mechanism of death. But the British didn't just starve Bengal by taking the food. They starved it by destroying the economy. In a colonial system, the mechanisms of mass death are often more sophisticated than simple confiscation. They involve markets, prices, and the deliberate manipulation of economic forces to extract wealth while people die. Here's how it worked in Bengal. When the British government started buying up rice to deny it to the Japanese and to stockpile it for military use, they created artificial demand. The price of rice skyrocketed. In January 1943, rice was selling at roughly 5 rupees per mond, a traditional unit of measurement. By July, the price had reached 30 rupees per mond. By October, it had hit 40 rupees. The price had increased by 800% in 9 months. For the millions of poor laborers, agricultural workers, and fishermen who made up the bulk of Bengal's population, this price increase was a death sentence. They didn't have the money to buy food at these prices. They starved, not because food didn't exist, but because they couldn't afford it. And who benefited from these price increases? The merchants, traders, and landowners who had rice to sell made enormous profits. The British colonial government bought rice at inflated prices, paying for it with money extracted from Indian taxpayers through taxes and forced loans. It was a system where the poor were taxed to pay inflated prices to the rich, while the poor themselves starved to death. The colonial authorities could have intervened. They could have imposed price controls. They could have rationed food. They could have nationalized the grain markets and distributed food directly to the starving. They did none of these things. They allowed the market to operate freely, knowing that free market prices and a shortage would kill millions of poor people. In fact, the British actively opposed price controls. When Indian members of the colonial administration proposed regulations to cap rice prices, British officials blocked them. They argued that price controls would discourage production and make the situation worse. This was economic orthodoxy masquerading as policy. It was ideology that valued market efficiency over human life. The inflation tax, but the economic extraction went deeper than just rice prices. The British government was financing its war effort in India by printing money. The colonial treasury issued massive amounts of new currency to pay for military spending, to buy supplies, and to pay Indian soldiers. This caused rapid inflation across the entire economy. Between 1939 and 1943, the money supply in India increased by 300%. Prices for all goods rose accordingly, but wages didn't rise. The millions of agricultural laborers and urban workers who depended on fixed wages or daily labor saw their purchasing power collapse. They could no longer afford food, rent, or basic necessities. This inflation was a hidden tax. It was a way for the British government to extract wealth from the Indian population without having to raise explicit taxes. The government printed money, used that money to buy goods and services, and left the Indian population to deal with the consequences of rising prices and collapsing purchasing power. For the poorest people in Bengal, the combination of food price increases and general inflation was catastrophic. Even if they could find food, they couldn't afford it. Even if they could find work, the wages weren't enough to survive. They were trapped in an economic system designed to extract resources for the empire while leaving them to die. And the British knew exactly what they were doing. Economic reports from the colonial administration detailed the inflation problem. They explained how rising prices were making it impossible for the poor to buy food. They warned that the situation would lead to mass starvation, and the reports were sent to London, where they were read and filed away and ignored. The priority system. To add another layer of cruelty, the British colonial government implemented a priority system for food distribution. They divided the population of India into categories based on their usefulness to the war effort. British soldiers and civilians were in the top category. They had guaranteed access to food at controlled prices. Indian soldiers and war workers were in the second category. They also had access to rations, though less generous than what the British received. The rest of the population, the farmers, laborers, and millions of ordinary civilians, were in the lowest category. They had no guaranteed access to food. They had to buy whatever was available on the open market, at whatever price they could afford. And when the famine hit, they were the ones who died. This system was explicit. It was written into colonial regulations. It was enforced by the police and the military. If you were in the wrong category, you starved. And the British decided who went into which category. The cover-up begins. Even as the famine raged, the British government was already working to control the narrative. They couldn't hide the deaths. Too many people were dying. Too many bodies were in the streets. Too many witnesses were seeing the horror. But they could shape how the story was told. The official line from the British government was that the famine was caused by natural factors. They blamed a cyclone that had hit Bengal in 1942. They blamed crop disease. They blamed hoarding by Indian merchants. They blamed the war and the disruption of trade with Burma. They blamed everything except their own policies. British officials instructed the press in India to minimize coverage of the famine. Newspapers were censored. Photographs of the dying were suppressed. Journalists who tried to report on the scale of the disaster were blocked from traveling to the affected areas. The colonial government used wartime censorship powers to control what information reached the public. When reports of the famine reached Britain, they were downplayed. The British press, operating under wartime censorship, largely ignored the story. The government line was that the situation in India was under control, that the reports were exaggerated, and that the colonial administration was doing everything possible to provide relief. It was a coordinated effort to suppress the truth, and it worked. The British public remained largely ignorant of what their government was doing in their name. The Americans, who were Britain's allies and who were supplying massive amounts of aid, were kept in the dark. The true scale of the death toll wouldn't be known for decades, but suppressing the story in real time was just the beginning. The real cover-up happened after the war, when the British government began the process of hiding the documentary evidence, the buried documents. After the war ended, as India moved toward independence, the British began a systematic effort to protect their historical reputation. Documents related to the Bengal Famine were classified. Cabinet records that showed Churchill's involvement were sealed. Communications between London and the colonial administration in India were buried in archives with restrictions that would last for decades. The official history of the war, written by British historians with government approval, barely mentioned the Bengal Famine. When it was mentioned, it was presented as a natural disaster that the British had done their best to mitigate. The policy decisions that caused the famine, the deliberate choices to prioritize military stockpiles over civilian lives, were omitted. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate effort to shape historical memory. The British government knew that the truth about the Bengal famine would destroy the narrative of World War II as a purely moral fight against fascism. It would reveal that Britain, while fighting the Nazis, was implementing policies that killed millions of its own colonial subjects through deliberate starvation. The documents remained classified for 70 years. It wasn't until 2014 that researchers gained access to some of the key files that revealed the extent of Churchill's involvement and the deliberate nature of the policies. Even now, some files remain sealed. The Famine Inquiry Commission. In 1944, as the famine was winding down and the death toll was becoming impossible to hide, the British government appointed an official inquiry. The Famine Inquiry Commission was tasked with investigating the causes of the famine and making recommendations to prevent future disasters. The Commission's report, published in 1945, was a masterpiece of evasion. It acknowledged that the famine had happened. It estimated the death toll at 1.5 million, though this was almost certainly an undercount. But it blamed the famine on a complex mix of factors: crop failure, wartime disruption, hoarding, speculation, and administrative failures at the local level. What the report didn't do was assign responsibility to the British government. It didn't mention Churchill's refusal to send food aid. It didn't discuss the denial policies. It didn't acknowledge that food was being exported from India while millions starved. It didn't explain why shipping was available for military stockpiles, but not for famine relief. The Commission presented the famine as a failure of markets and local administration, not as a policy choice made in London. It was a whitewash, and it became the basis for how the famine was remembered for decades. Indian historians and independence leaders knew the truth. They knew that the British had deliberately starved Bengal, but they were dismissed as biased, as anti-British, as exaggerating for political purposes. The British version of events became the dominant narrative in Western histories of World War II. The human cost numbers can't capture the reality of what happened in Bengal. 3 million dead is a statistic, but each of those deaths was a person. A child who starved to death in their mother's arms, a farmer who walked to the city looking for work and collapsed on the road, an elderly person who gave their food to their grandchildren and quietly died in their sleep. The famine destroyed families. Parents watched their children waste away and could do nothing. Children watched their parents grow weaker day by day until they died. Siblings were separated when families broke apart, some members leaving to search for food while others stayed behind. Many never found each other again. The social fabric of Bengal was torn apart. Villages that had existed for centuries were abandoned. The survivors fled, becoming refugees in their own country. The traditional structures of community, of mutual aid, of shared resources, all collapsed under the pressure of mass starvation. And the trauma didn't end when the famine ended. The survivors carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. They had nightmares about hunger. They hoarded food obsessively. They couldn't trust that food security would last. An entire generation was marked by the experience of watching millions of people die while the government that ruled them did nothing. The survivors also carried physical scars. Malnutrition during the famine caused permanent health damage. Children who survived suffered stunted growth and cognitive impairment. Women who were pregnant during the famine gave birth to children with developmental problems. The health effects of the famine echoed through generations, but perhaps the deepest wound was the betrayal. The people of Bengal had believed, or at least hoped, that the British government had some obligation to protect them. They were British subjects. They paid taxes to the empire. They sent their sons to fight in British wars. And when they needed help, when they were dying by the millions, the empire abandoned them. This betrayal radicalized Indian politics. The Bengal famine became a rallying cry for the independence movement. It proved to millions of Indians that British rule was not just exploitative, it was murderous. The British couldn't be reformed. They had to be expelled. The political fallout, the famine, had immediate political consequences within India. The Indian National Congress, which had been pushing for independence, pointed to the famine as definitive proof that British rule was incompatible with Indian welfare. Mahatma Gandhi, who had been advocating for nonviolent resistance, now had millions of dead Indians as evidence that the British government was willing to kill on a massive scale to maintain colonial control. The Communist Party of India grew rapidly in Bengal after the famine. The communists organized relief efforts when the government wouldn't. They distributed food. They set up medical clinics. They documented the deaths and blamed the British explicitly. The famine turned Bengal into a communist stronghold, and the British would never fully regain control of the region. Even moderate Indians who had supported the empire began to turn against it. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, civil servants, people who had worked within the colonial system and believed in gradual reform, saw the famine and realized that the system couldn't be saved. It had to be dismantled. The British, for their part, tried to blame Indian politicians. They suggested that the Indian National Congress had sabotaged relief efforts for political purposes. They claimed that Indian merchants had created the famine by hoarding and speculation. They tried to deflect responsibility onto Indians themselves, but these arguments couldn't hold. Too many people had seen British officials confiscating rice. Too many people knew that food was being exported while they starved. Too many people had witnessed the government's indifference. The British could control the press, but they couldn't control the memory of millions of survivors. The long-term economic damage. The famine didn't just kill 3 million people, it destroyed the economy of Bengal for a generation. The agricultural system, which had been disrupted by the denial policies, never fully recovered. Farmers who had lost their land during the famine couldn't get it back. The credit system collapsed because moneylenders died or fled. The rural economy, which had been subsistence level before the famine, fell into desperate poverty afterward. The urban economy was also devastated. Calcutta, which had been one of the great cities of the British Empire, was overwhelmed by refugees and corpses. The city's infrastructure collapsed. Disease spread through the overcrowded slums. The death rate from tuberculosis, cholera, and other diseases skyrocketed and remained high for years after the famine ended. Bengal, which had been one of the wealthiest regions of India, became one of the poorest. The famine impoverished millions of people who survived. They lost their savings, their land, their livestock, their tools. They had nothing left. And the colonial government provided no reconstruction aid, no compensation, no help rebuilding what had been destroyed. The Imperial Ledger. The Bengal famine must be understood in the context of how the British financed their war effort. Britain was fighting a war it couldn't afford. The empire was bankrupt. The only way to keep fighting was to extract resources from the colonies, particularly from India. India paid for Britain's war in multiple ways. Indian soldiers fought and died on every front. Over 2 million Indian soldiers served in British uniform. Tens of thousands died in Burma, North Africa, and Europe. They were paid a fraction of what British soldiers received, and their families received little compensation when they died. But the real cost was economic. Britain forced India to pay for the war through a system of forced loans and inflated military expenditures. The colonial government spent massive amounts of rupees on military operations in India and Southeast Asia. This money was created by printing new currency, which caused the inflation that made food unaffordable for millions. At the same time, India was forced to sell food, raw materials, and manufactured goods to Britain at artificially low prices. These exports were paid for with paper credits that were essentially IOUs from a bankrupt empire. India was giving Britain real goods and getting worthless promises in return. By the end of the war, Britain owed India over £1.3 billion, an astronomical sum that represented decades of forced loans and unpaid exports. This debt was called the sterling balances. Britain never paid it back. When India became independent in 1947, the British government renegotiated the debt on terms that ensured India would never recover the full amount. The Bengal famine was the most extreme example of this extraction, but it wasn't the only one. The entire colonial economy was designed to transfer wealth from India to Britain. The famine was just the moment when the mask slipped, when the violence inherent in the system became impossible to hide. Churchill's legacy? Winston Churchill died in 1965, celebrated as the man who saved Western civilization from fascism. His funeral was a state occasion attended by world leaders. He was mourned as a hero. The Bengal famine was not mentioned in his obituaries. For decades after his death, Churchill's reputation remained untarnished in the West. He was the subject of countless biographies, all of which focused on his leadership during the war and his stirring speeches. The few historians who mentioned the Bengal famine presented it as a regrettable but unavoidable consequence of wartime conditions. But Churchill's own words condemn him. The cabinet records, the private letters, the documented statements, all of them reveal a man who viewed Indian lives as worthless. He didn't cause the famine through incompetence or oversight. He caused it through deliberate policy choices driven by racist contempt. In recent years, as the classified documents have become available, Churchill's reputation has begun to shift, at least outside Britain. Historians in India, Bangladesh, and among scholars of colonialism have documented his role in the famine. They have shown that he was not just indifferent to Indian suffering, he was actively hostile to providing relief. But in Britain itself, Churchill remains a revered figure. Statues of him stand in central London. His image is on currency. Polls regularly name him the greatest Briton in history. The British public has been taught a version of World War II that erases the Bengal famine, that ignores the atrocities committed by the empire, that presents Britain as purely heroic. This willful ignorance is itself a form of violence. It allows the British to celebrate their history without confronting its darkest chapters. It allows them to honor a man who was responsible for the deaths of 3 million people. It perpetuates the lie that the empire was a civilizing force rather than a system of exploitation and murder. The partition connection. The Bengal famine also played a role in the partition of India in 1947. The famine had devastated Bengal, and the region's economy never recovered. When India was divided into India and Pakistan, Bengal itself was split. The eastern part became East Pakistan, later Bangladesh. The partition was accompanied by horrific violence. Millions of people were displaced. Hundreds of thousands were killed in communal riots. The British, eager to leave India as quickly as possible, did almost nothing to prevent the violence. They drew the borders hastily, without regard for the populations that would be affected, and then withdrew. The connection between the famine and the partition is rarely discussed, but it's real. The famine destroyed the social cohesion of Bengal. It created deep resentments between different communities. It showed that the British government couldn't or wouldn't protect Indian lives. All of these factors contributed to the chaos of partition. The reckoning that never came. The British government has never apologized for the Bengal famine. There has been no official recognition of responsibility. There has been no compensation to the victims or their descendants. There has been no truth and reconciliation process. The famine remains a historical footnote in British education, barely mentioned in schools, absent from the national narrative about World War II. This silence is not accidental. To acknowledge the Bengal famine fully would require acknowledging that Britain, while fighting a war against fascist atrocities, was committing its own atrocity on a massive scale. It would require admitting that Churchill, the hero of the war, was also a mass murderer. It would require confronting the fundamental truth that the British Empire was built on violence and extraction, not civilization and progress. The British are not alone in this denial. The Western historical narrative of World War II is told as a simple story of good versus evil, of democracies fighting fascism. But the reality was far more complex. The Allied powers included colonial empires that ruled over hundreds of millions of people through violence and exploitation. Britain fought the Nazis while starving millions of Indians. France fought for freedom while maintaining brutal colonial regimes in Africa and Asia. The United States fought for democracy while segregating black Americans and incarcerating Japanese Americans. The Bengal Famine exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of this narrative. It shows that the war was not purely about moral principles. It was about power, about which empires would dominate the post-war world, about economic and strategic interests. And the people who paid the price for these power struggles were the colonized populations who had no voice, no power, and no protection. The lessons never learned. What makes the Bengal Famine even more tragic is that the lessons were never learned. The same patterns of extraction and exploitation continued after World War II. The same economic systems that caused the famine continue to impoverish the developing world. The same indifference to the lives of poor people, especially poor people in former colonies, continues to shape global policy. Famines are not natural disasters. They are policy choices. They happen when governments prioritize other objectives over feeding their populations. They happen when food is available but people can't afford it. They happen when the powerful decide that some lives matter less than others. The Bengal Famine of 1943 killed 3 million people because the British government decided that Indian lives were worth less than military stockpiles. It was a calculation made in cabinet rooms in London by men who never missed a meal, who never saw the bodies in the streets of Calcutta, who never had to explain to a starving child why there was no food. And the calculation worked, from their perspective. Britain continued fighting the war. The strategic objectives were achieved. The empire survived for a few more years before collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The men who made these decisions died in comfort, celebrated as heroes. The 3 million dead Indians got no monuments. They got no recognition. Most of them died anonymously, buried in mass graves or cremated in bulk, their names unrecorded, their stories untold. They were erased from history as thoroughly as they were erased from life. The debt, still unpaid. The Bengal Famine is not just history. It is a debt that has never been paid. The British extracted wealth from India for 2 centuries. They extracted resources, labor, and lives. They left India impoverished and partitioned, and they never gave back what they took. India today is a democracy and an economic power, but it is still dealing with a legacy of colonial exploitation. The poverty, the underdeveloped infrastructure, the regional inequalities, all of these have roots in the colonial period. And the Bengal Famine is part of that legacy, a scar on the collective memory of the region. For the descendants of those who died, the famine is not a distant historical event. It is a family story, passed down through generations. My grandfather survived. My grandmother didn't. These are the stories that shape how millions of people understand their history and their relationship with the West. The story of the Bengal Famine is the story of how empires kill, not with gas chambers or firing squads, but with policy documents and bureaucratic indifference. Not with hate, but with cold calculation. Not with malice, but with the simple belief that some lives matter and others don't. 3 million people were killed by a government that decided they were expendable, and the world moved on. The war was won, the empire eventually fell, and the dead were forgotten. Until now.